Chapter 2 of A Smile of Fortune by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Dann. A Smile of Fortune, Chapter 2. I would have gladly dispensed with the mournful opportunity of becoming acquainted by sight with all my fellow captains at once. However, I found my way to the cemetery. We made a considerable group of bare-headed men in sombre garments. I noticed that those of our company most approaching to the now obsolete sea-dog type were the most moved, perhaps because they had less manner than the new generation. The old sea-dog, away from his natural element, was a simple and sentimental animal. I noticed one. He was facing me across the grave, who was dropping tears. They trickled down his weather-beaten face like drops of rain on an old rugged wall. I learned afterwards that he was looked upon as the terror of sailors, a hard man, that he had never had a wife or chick of his own, and that, engaged from his tenderest years in deep-sea voyages, he knew women and children merely by sight. Perhaps he was dropping those tears over his lost opportunities, from sheer envy of paternity and in strange jealousy of a sorrow which he could never know. Man, and even the sea man, is a capricious animal, the creature and the victim of lost opportunities. But he made me feel ashamed of my callousness. I had no tears. I listened with horribly critical detachment to that service I had had to read myself once or twice over childlike men who had died at sea. The words of hope and defiance, the winged words so inspiring in the free immensity of water and sky, seemed to fall wearily into the little grave. What was the use of asking death where her sting was before that small dark hole in the ground? And then my thoughts escaped me altogether, away into matters of life, and no very high matters at that, ships, freights, business. In the instability of his emotions, man resembles deplorably a monkey. I was disgusted with my thoughts, and I thought, shall I be able to get a charter soon? Time's money. Will that Jacobus really put good business in my way? I must go and see him in a day or two. Don't imagine that I pursued these thoughts with any precision. They pursued me, rather, vague, shadowy, restless, shamefaced. Theirs was a callous, abominable, almost revolting pertinacity. And it was the presence of that pertinacious ship chandler which had started them. He stood mournfully amongst our little band of men from the sea, and I was angry at his presence, which, suggesting his brother the merchant, had caused me to become outrageous to myself. For indeed I had preserved some decency of feeling. It was only the mind which... It was over at last. The poor father, a man of 40 with black bushy side whiskers and a pathetic gash on his freshly shaved chin, thanked us all, swallowing his tears. But for some reason, either because I lingered at the gate of the cemetery, being somewhat hazy as to my way back, or because I was the youngest, or ascribing my moodiness caused by remorse to some more worthy and appropriate sentiment, or simply because I was even more of a stranger to him than the others, he singled me out. Keeping at my side, he renewed his thanks, which I listened to in a gloomy, conscience-stricken silence. Suddenly he slipped one hand under my arm, and waved the other after a tall, stout figure walking away by itself down a street in a flutter of thin, grey garments. "That's a good fellow, a real good fellow," he swallowed down a belated sob. "This Jacobus." And he told me in a low voice that Jacobus was the first man to board his ship on arrival, and learning of their misfortune, had taken charge of everything, volunteered to attend to all routine business, carried off the ship's papers on shore, arranged for the funeral. A good fellow. I was knocked over. I had been looking at my wife for 10 days, and helpless. Just you think of that. The dear little chap died the very day we made the land. How I managed to take the ship in, God alone knows. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't speak. I couldn't... You've heard perhaps that we lost our mate overboard on the passage. There was no one to do it for me, and the poor woman nearly crazy down below there, all alone with the... By the Lord, it isn't fair. We walked in silence together. I did not know how to part from him. On the quay he let go my arm and struck fiercely his fist into the palm of his other hand. "By God, it isn't fair," he cried again. "Don't you ever marry unless you can chuck the sea first. It isn't fair." I had no intention to chuck the sea, and when he left me to go aboard his ship, I felt convinced that I would never marry. While I was waiting at the steps for Jacobus's boatman, who had gone off somewhere, the captain of the Hilda joined me, a slender silk umbrella in his hand and the sharp points of his archaic Gladstonian shirt collar framing a small, clean-shaved, ruddy face. It was wonderfully fresh for his age, beautifully modelled and lit up by remarkably clear blue eyes. A lot of white hair, glossy like spun glass, curled upwards slightly under the brim of his valuable ancient Panama hat with a broad black ribbon. In the aspect of that vivacious, neat little old man there was something quaintly angelic and also boyish. He accosted me, as though he had been in the habit of seeing me every day of his life from my earliest childhood, with a whimsical remark on the appearance of a stout negro woman who was sitting upon a stool near the edge of the quay. Presently he observed amiably that I had a very pretty little bark. I returned this civil speech by saying readily, "Not so pretty as the Hilda." At once the corners of his clear-cut, sensitive mouth dropped dismally. "Oh dear, I can hardly bear to look at her now." Did I know, he asked anxiously, that he had lost the figurehead of his ship, a woman in a blue tunic edged with gold, the face perhaps not so very, very pretty, but her bare white arms beautifully shaped and extended as if she was swimming? Did I? Who would have expected such a thing? After 20 years, too. Nobody could have guessed from his tone that the woman was made of wood. His trembling voice, his agitated manner, gave to his lamentations a ludicrously scandalous flavour. Disappeared at night, a clear fine night with just a slight swell, in the Gulf of Bengal. Went off without a splash. No one in the ship could tell why, how, at what hour. After 20 years, last October. Did I ever hear? I assured him sympathetically that I had never heard, and he became very doleful. This meant no good, he was sure. There was something in it which looked like a warning. But when I remarked that surely another figure of a woman could be procured, I found myself being soundly rated for my levity. The old boy flushed pink under his clear tan, as if I had proposed something improper. One could replace masts, I was told, or a lost rudder, any working part of a ship, but where was the use of sticking up a new figurehead? What satisfaction? How could one care for it? It was easy to see that I had never been shipmates with a figurehead for over 20 years. "A new figurehead," he scolded in unquenchable indignation. "Why, I've been a widower now for 28 years come next May, and I would just as soon think of getting a new wife. You're as bad as that fellow Jacobus." I was highly amused. "What has Jacobus done? Did he want you to marry again, Captain?" I inquired in a deferential tone. But he was launched now, and only grinned fiercely. Procure, indeed. He's the sort of chap to procure you anything you like for a price. I hadn't been moored here for an hour when he got on board and at once offered to sell me a figurehead he happens to have in his yard somewhere. He got Smith, my mate, to talk to me about it. "Mr. Smith," says I, "don't you know me better than that? Am I the sort that would pick up with another man's cast-off figurehead? And after all these years, too, the way some of you young fellows talk." I affected great compunction, and as I stepped into the boat I said soberly, "Then I see nothing for it but to fit in a neat fiddlehead, perhaps. You know, carved scroll-work, nicely gilt." He became very dejected after his outburst. "Yes, scroll-work, maybe. Jacobus hinted at that too. He's never at a loss when there's any money to be extracted from a sailor man. He would make me pay through the nose for that carving. A gilt figurehead, did you say, eh? I dare say it would do for you. You young fellows don't seem to have any feeling for what's proper." He made a convulsive gesture with his right arm. "Never mind, nothing can make much difference. I would just as soon let the old thing go about the world with a bare cutwater," he cried sadly. Then, as the boat got away from the steps, he raised his voice on the edge of the quay with comical animosity. "I would, if only to spite that figurehead-procuring bloodsucker. I'm an old bird here, and don't you forget it. Come and see me on board some day." I spent my first evening in port quietly in my ship's cuddy, and glad enough was I to think that the shore life which strikes one as so pettily complex, discordant, and so full of new faces on first coming from sea could be kept off for a few hours longer. I was, however, fated to hear the Jacobus note once more before I slept. Mr. Burns had gone ashore after the evening meal to have, as he said, a look round. As it was quite dark when he announced his intention, I didn't ask him what it was he expected to see. Some time about midnight, while sitting with a book in the saloon, I heard cautious movements in the lobby and hailed him by name. Burns came in, stick and hat in hand, incredibly vulgarised by his smart shore togs, with a jaunty air and an odious twinkle in his eye. Being asked to sit down, he laid his hat and stick on the table, and after we had talked of ship affairs for a little while, "I've been hearing pretty tales on shore about that ship chandler fellow who snatched the job from you so neatly, sir." I remonstrated with my late patient for his manner of expressing himself, but he only tossed his head disdainfully. "A pretty dodge indeed, boarding a strange ship with breakfast in 2 baskets for all hands and calmly inviting himself to the captain's table. Never heard of anything so crafty and so impudent in his life." I found myself defending Jacobus's unusual methods. "He's the brother of one of the wealthiest merchants in the port." The mate's eyes fairly snapped green sparks. "His grand brother hasn't spoken to him for 18 or 20 years, he declared triumphantly. "So there." "I know all about that," I interrupted loftily. "Do you, sir? His mind was still running on the ethics of commercial competition. "I don't like to see your good nature taken advantage of. He's bribed that steward of ours with a 5-rupee note to let him come down, or 10 for that matter. He don't care. He will shove that and more into the bill presently." "Is that one of the tales you've heard ashore?" I asked. He assured me that his own sense could tell him that much. No, what he had heard on shore was that no respectable person in the whole town would come near Jacobus. He lived in a large old-fashioned house in one of the quiet streets with a big garden. After telling me this, Burns put on a mysterious air. "He keeps a girl shut up there who, they say—" "I suppose you've heard all this gossip in some eminently respectable place?" I snapped at him in a most sarcastic tone. The shaft told, because Mr. Burns, like many other disagreeable people, was very sensitive himself. He remained as if thunderstruck, with his mouth open for some further communication, but I did not give him the chance. "And anyhow, what the deuce do I care?" I added, retiring into my room. And this was a natural thing to say, yet somehow I was not indifferent. I admit it is absurd to be concerned with the morals of one's ship chandler, if ever so well connected, but his personality had stamped itself upon my first day in harbour in the way you know. After this initial exploit, Jacobus showed himself anything but intrusive. He was out in a boat early every morning going round the ships he served, and occasionally remaining on board one of them for breakfast with the captain. As I discovered that this practice was generally accepted, I just nodded to him familiarly when, one morning, on coming out of my room, I found him in the cabin. Glancing over the table, I saw that his place was already laid. He stood awaiting my appearance, very bulky and placid, holding a beautiful bunch of flowers in his thick hand. He offered them to my notice with a faint, sleepy smile. From his own garden. Had a very fine old garden. Picked them himself that morning before going out to business. Thought I would like. He turned away. "Steward, can you oblige me with some water in a large jar, please?" I assured him jocularly, as I took my place at the table, that he made me feel as if I were a pretty girl, and that he mustn't be surprised if I blushed. But he was busy arranging his floral tribute at the sideboard. "Stand it before the captain's plate, steward, please." He made this request in his usual undertone. The offering was so pointed that I could do no less than to raise it to my nose, and as he sat down noiselessly, he breathed out the opinion that a few flowers improved notably the appearance of a ship's saloon. He wondered why I did not have a shelf fitted all round the skylight for flowers in pots to take with me to sea. He had a skilled workman able to fit up shelves in a day, and he could procure me 2 or 3 dozen good plants. The tips of his thick, round fingers rested composedly on the edge of the table on each side of his cup of coffee. His face remained immovable. Mr. Burns was smiling maliciously to himself. I declared that I hadn't the slightest intention of turning my skylight into a conservatory, only to keep the cabin table in a perpetual mess of mould and dead vegetable matter. "Rare, most beautiful flowers," he insisted with an upward glance. "It's no trouble, really." "Oh, yes, it is. Lots of trouble," I contradicted. "And in the end some fool leaves the skylight open in a fresh breeze, a flick of salt water gets at them, and the whole lot is dead in a week." Mr. Burns snorted a contemptuous approval. Jacobus gave up the subject passively. After a time he unglued his thick lips to ask me if I had seen his brother yet. I was very curt in my answer. "No, not yet." "A very different person," he remarked dreamily, and got up. His movements were particularly noiseless. "Well, thank you, Captain. If anything is not to your liking, please mention it to your steward. I suppose you will be giving a dinner to the office clerks presently?" "What for?" I cried with some warmth. "If I were a steady trader to the port, I could understand it, but a complete stranger? I may not turn up again here for years. I don't see why. Do you mean to say it is customary?" "It will be expected from a man like you," he breathed out placidly. 8 of the principal clerks, the manager, that's 9, you 3 gentlemen, that's 12. It needn't be very expensive, if you tell your steward to give me a day's notice." "It will be expected of me? Why should it be expected of me? Is it because I look particularly soft, or what?" His immobility struck me as dignified suddenly, his imperturbable quality as dangerous. "There's plenty of time to think about that," I concluded weakly, with a gesture that tried to wave him away. But before he departed, he took time to mention regretfully that he had not yet had the pleasure of seeing me at his store to sample those cigars. He had a parcel of 6,000 to dispose of, very cheap. "I think it would be worth your while to secure some," he added with a fat, melancholy smile, and left the cabin. Mr. Burns struck his fist on the table excitedly. "Did you ever see such impudence? He's made up his mind to get something out of you one way or another, sir." At once feeling inclined to defend Jacobus, I observed philosophically that all this was business, I supposed. But my absurd mate, muttering broken, disjointed sentences such as "I cannot bear," "mark my words," and so on, flung out of the cabin. If I hadn't nursed him through that deadly fever, I wouldn't have suffered such manners for a single day. End of chapter 2.
Thank you for listening to this chapter. If you'd like to keep following this story or discover more fascinating tales, be sure to subscribe to our channel and enable notifications. We look forward to sharing the next exciting chapter with you. Until next time.